Hi there, welcome to another Trust Talks with me, Patrick Donegan from HardenStance, and the good people of Enea AdaptiveMobile Security, who on this occasion are represented by Simeon Coney, who is Chief Strategy Officer. Hi Simeon, how are you doing?
Patrick, hi. Yeah, doing really well, thanks.
Good to see you. And also Rowland Corr, a new employee brought on board to AdaptiveMobile Security. He is Rowland Corr, and he is Director of National Intelligence. How are you, Rowland? You well?
Very well, Patrick. Thanks very much. And hi, Simeon. Great to join you guys for this afternoon.
Great to see you. Okay, so according to our usual format, we have 3 segments today. We are going to be discussing initially some company news with Simeon. We're going to be talking about some aspects of AdaptiveMobile Security and where the company's got to and where it's going a little bit. We will be discussing the topic of the day, which is Rowland's core subject matter, which is the mobile network battlefield. Lastly, we'll look a little bit at some key issues that we've noted over the course of the last couple of months that these guys would like to talk about a little bit. And those subjects are, for example, an old friend, stir shaken, and just how clever or not the FCC is being in the way that it's being rolled out. We're also going to be talking about an old adversary, Pegasus, and the way it's rearing its ugly head again. And we have some news about the Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit, which we'll keep right until the very end. So let's get started with the company updates, Simeon. What have you got for us? You've got a name change, for example. What's that all about? What's new with you guys?
Yeah, Patrick. So we've had a rebrand, and really that further integrates with Enea while maintaining our security focus and brand association. So AdaptiveMobile's strong security credentials within the industry really significantly strengthens the Enea cybersecurity portfolio, broadening the offering to operators, including such areas like 5G security. And there's scope to leverage product synergies between the Enea business units that will really drive market and customer penetration. And Enea really recognize the changing geopolitical situation means that cybersecurity for telecom system now is more relevant than ever. And they really see the great value in our security expertise. Many countries and telecom operators need to investigate in security. So Enea and AMS as a business unit under its helm will really continue to research and develop products and go-to-market capabilities in this regard.
And another industry award to announce, I gather, another gong.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah, we won the Global Mobile Award, the GLOMO, for the best authentication and security solution for mobile networks at this year's Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. We're delighted to receive this. It recognizes our 5G network security solution, and it really acknowledges a critical role that security plays in making 5G a success. 5G is changing the game in terms of security threats and challenges. We've done a lot of research in this area. We've spoken before about the slicing vulnerabilities that we uncovered even before the technology was deployed. Other research that we've released looked at the future of messaging, and it shows again the impact that 5G is going to have on SMS. And despite what many think, that's not going away anytime soon. And also, it's worth mentioning that we were recently recognized as a top vendor for our signaling firewall by ROCCO Research in their recent benchmarking test. And that's really important to us because they research that from the most important people in the value chain there, our customers. So receiving that recognition from the industry experts is important, but really gratifying to get that acknowledgement from our partners and customers.
And anything else that's new you want to tell us about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been making quite a few developments across our messaging portfolio of products and several innovations that we've been researching at present. And I really hope we can pick up on that in the next Trust Talks. Also, we're delighted to continue our partnership with the MEF, that's the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, and we're sponsoring a number of their events actually this year across business messaging, wholesale and omnichannel. So we're going to be really excited to talk about new trends in the industry and how our products can and do have significant and unique value for many of the players in the A2P and brand engagement ecosystem. So we've got the first of those kicking off in Amsterdam on the 14th of June. So yeah, watch this space, Patrick.
Terrific. Okay, let's move on to the next section. So the main topic of the day we're going to talk about now is the mobile network battlefield. And I'm joined again by Rowland to talk about that. Hi again, Rowland.
Hi again, Patrick.
So obviously the fundamentals that we're going to draw on are the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what we've seen in terms of the last couple of months there. Now, at the outset of the invasion, I would suppose that it was very, very common that most of us assumed that the cyber realm would feature in some substantial way over the course of the conflict, and so it has proved. I guess we didn't really know at the outset what sort of role the cyber realm would play. Would it kind of sit side by side with the physical world of troops and guns and missiles? Would it have a kind of some kind of a backseat in terms of the role that it played in sort of defensive and offensive operations? Would we have something that we might call hybrid war? Would we have something that some people might call cyber war? Might we have some kind of Stuxnet type affair? And what might that do? Might it sort of be used to undermine and power down nuclear reactors? Or, God forbid, could it be used to do quite the contrary and set them off in a pretty ghastly catastrophe of some kind? So when you look at the media reporting of the term cyber war and the role of cyber in the conflict over the last couple of months, Rowland, what are your thoughts on how that's been represented and interpreted?
I think the short and emphatic answer to all of the questions that you posed there, Patrick, is yes. And I also think it's worth actually dwelling on your question for a moment as to what we might see, because there is a question, isn't there, of what we're able to see in the context of that kind of activity. And then related to that is more fundamentally a question, I suppose, of what we expect to see. That is to say, our assumptions about cyber war, because that conditions our perception, how we interpret it, and it goes to also where we look for it and what we look for, and how we actually understand cyber warfare in progress or in prospect in respect of Ukraine. And I think the reporting, it's been remarkable in many ways, and it has reflected, on the one hand, a real variance of interpretations and opinions, but from another perspective, I think it also arguably reflects a certain narrowness of assumptions in play. And I think the war in Ukraine has helped to highlight where those gaps are, and where what we have seen to be let's call it a certain tunnel vision with respect to approaches to cyber warfare. And that isn't, this is something that's actually been highlighted before. Enea, so the European Network and Information Security Agency, actually identified sort of a tendency towards myopic views of cybersecurity as far back as 2016. And that's been reflected and recognized in other quarters as well. I think the developments in Ukraine in the cyber context, I think have really highlighted that. And we've tried to draw attention to a broader context of cyber warfare by actually in our research, and by terming it the mobile network battlefield.
And when you talk about narrowness, when you talk about myopia, what's missing in the broader definition, the broader understanding that you'd like to see?
That's a great question, because in terms of established, let's say, definitions of cybersecurity, all of the broadness and the required breadth is there. But what's happened is, and this is why Enea flagged that in the study was about the definitions, differing definitions in different contexts of cybersecurity, is that it tends actually to be applied in a very narrow context, and has become, in practical terms, in many quarters, synonymous with essentially IT security, internet-based attacks on IT and computer network environments. Now, as we've highlighted in our research, Patrick, there is, of course, it is legitimate to treat, let's say, cyberspace as a distinct domain of cyber operations. What we also try to highlight is that it can be problematic, especially in the context of warfare, to treat it as a discrete and isolated domain, because the state-level cyber threat actors don't confine themselves to, aren't bound by semantic notions and definitions of one domain or another. They engage in multiple domains. They pursue activities, they prosecute their objectives within cyberspace and around it at one and the same time. And that's why we've tried to draw attention to the mobile network battlefield. Because, to go back to your first question, there is the question of the cyber attacks, the cyber warfare that we now see as being ongoing. But initially it wasn't as apparent, was it? I mean, that's actually that's why you've framed the question as you have. But in recent weeks, the reporting from Microsoft makes it clear that there's been an onslaught of cyber attacks in the way that many people expected. against Ukrainian infrastructure, against financial sector, critical infrastructure sectors, providers of essential services, government entities, of course, as well. But what we've tried to highlight is that's part of the story, just part of the story. So there is still an unseen cyber war very much going on. And ironically, a lot of the activity is actually taking place in the open. And it's been reported on, but not in the same way, not in the context of the overall cyber warfare that's taking place. And in fact, as we've tried to demonstrate and highlight, it can be shown and readily understood how mobile network enabled capabilities, offensive and defensive, can be at the absolute heart of cyber warfare, cyber threats, and by extension, national security and the defense of countries against state-level threats.
So, if I understand you correctly, then the position you're articulating is that, in your mind, the way cybersecurity at a national level has typically been seen has been one in which the telecom sector, the mobile network sector, kind of features as a kind of poor second cousin of broader IT security, and that somehow the experience of Ukraine in the last few weeks has shown that kind of bifurcation and that kind of relegation of telecom security to kind of secondary supporting role is really just not appropriate. And you would argue that needs evening up and kind of balancing up somehow?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue it's potentially, in many cases, worse than that, Patrick, where telecoms network security, national mobile network security doesn't figure even in national cybersecurity frameworks. And of course, there are historical reasons for that. But the point to what Ukraine has shown us, and actually to illustrate the difference in the reporting. So I mentioned recent reporting revealing just the sheer scale of cyber warfare being waged by Russia against Ukrainian networks.
You mentioned Microsoft, I think, Rowland. Do you want to
yes,
sum that particular research you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. The Microsoft reporting. What was really fascinating about that is some of the language used. The word cyber war didn't feature. It was termed hybrid warfare. So in the accompanying blog by John Hultquist, he clearly links it to an onslaught of cyber attacks as part of hybrid war against Ukraine. What's not mentioned there, but is reflected, and by the way, I do want to highlight that in terms of messaging and reporting, the Ukrainian government has been consistent and clear in their statements to the public from before and certainly since Russia invaded, that there has indeed been a cyber war waged against them and ongoing. But the difference there is reporting or recent statements by Natalia Tkachuk. She's the head of Ukraine's cyber information security and cybersecurity agency.
Yeah.
She has referred and talked about all of that activity, the same kind of activity, and in the same breath mentioned having already seen attempts by Russian forces and the invading force to weaponize captured mobile network infrastructure on the battlefield. So you see that Ukraine shows us that the two aren't discrete. So we see it being used.
When you talk about capturing mobile network infrastructure, I think that's the word you use. Do you want to give us some examples? What do you mean by that?
Well, this was there's not a lot of, let's say, publicly available information on that. In fact, I believe Mr. Tkachuk's comment might be one of the very few references to it, but it clearly refers to occupied territories, newly conquered territories, where infrastructure is now in the hands of the invading forces. And if you look at the wider context of what we've seen to date, reporting of the seeming difficulties and deficiencies by many accounts of the Russian forces in terms of their command and control, and remarkable reliance on civilian mobile network infrastructure and mobile comms for command and control, not even just as a backup system. So it refers to, as Cathal highlighted actually in the most recent installment of our series on the mobile network battlefield, this capturing of equipment and attempts to use that by Russia and to weaponize it reflects them trying to offset and to compensate for really significant action taken by the civilian actors, the many civilian defenders of Ukraine. And we have to give mention to first among them in the context of the cyber war to the operators and the action they took on day one of the invasion to block Russian SIM and Belarusian SIM registration in the country, because the principle in play is about denying connectivity to the threat actor as far as possible to mitigate the potential for the enemy to weaponize your own infrastructure against you. And as Cathal pointed out, that can't be, you can't conceive of such a measure and execute it spontaneously. That reflects recognition long in advance of that potential threat preparation to that end, and decisive action when the invasion happened, to deny as far as possible that the country's mobile infrastructure against the country itself, against its citizens, and against, of course, the state. And this is where the mobile network battlefield, as we've called it, is important to highlight, because unlike other areas of cyberspace, which of course is a virtual space disconnected from the physical space, where the actual battlefield and cyberspace and cyber terrain all meet and one and intersect is via the mobile devices in the hands of all the actors in the battlefield, the defenders, the attackers, the citizens, and of course, mobile connectivity more fundamentally. And we see that the digital battle lines are drawn firmly over mobile connectivity on the battlefield.
So one of the things you mentioned a couple of minutes ago was the action of the Ukrainian operators in blocking incoming roamers from Russia immediately on the night of the invasion. Now, that's just one of the things you guys have been reporting on over the course of the last couple of months, if I can say so. I would say AdaptiveMobile has not just been unusual in the amount of coverage and public discussion that you've engaged in with what's going on in Ukraine. I'd go further and say that you've been exceptional. So the blocking of incoming roamers was one thing, but obviously, the mobile networks have been used for a variety of different aspects by a different variety of actors to achieve different war-related or war defense-related objectives. So blocking incoming roamers, but what about some of the other dimensions of this?
Yes, the blocking of the Russian and Belarusian SIM registration was the first in a series of extremely important measures as part of what we saw as Ukraine's total cyber defense of the country against invasion. Other measures were initially additional allocation of frequencies, and then the subsequent implementation of national roaming, because Ukraine has had to, and they have very effectively, struck this balance strategically between denying connectivity and the potential for it to be weaponized. Remember, that's what's key here. That's the principle that's reflected and demonstrated to the enemy. And at the same time, however, critically maximizing the availability of mobile services to Ukrainian citizens who are most obviously desperately affected by this on a day-to-day basis and rely on it for keeping in touch with their families. So on the battlefield, we see that there's very, very profound effects of those actions, and Ukraine is the measures enacted have shown that balance being struck, and it's because they have an integrated approach. One, a recognition of the significance of mobile network-enabled threats as a vector, and then two, the fact that it's not a discrete, that it actually is inextricable with everything else that you hope to achieve and you recognize as imperative in terms of cybersecurity, because these are all so many network-related and network-enabled vectors that threat actors use. That's where the relevance then of this in terms of cyber threats, even just cyber threats, for many countries, where there are lessons to be drawn in terms of approach. But coming back to actually the focus of your question on the different measures. So there's also, of course, the Ukrainian government created mobile apps that also have helped to enhance their total defense. So there was actually one that was converted. The app existed. It was called Enea, which was where Ukrainian citizens could access their identity documents and other government services online. Is now e-Varog, I believe, e-enemy. So it's to enable the potential identification of the location of Russian forces, and that being integrated into the defensive effort. That's the essence of hybrid defense, the integration of non-military measures, and really uniquely and profoundly important in this case, non-military actors, civilian actors, able to those efforts and their awareness and that ability to create and leverage your domestic information environment against this conventional military foe to great effect. And of course, that is natural, you would say, in terms of being called for when it's a hybrid threat, and hybrid warfare is what you're actually facing, which is the other side of the coin, and what's mitigated to a really, really important degree by the measures of the Ukrainian operators in trying to deny the connectivity. That actually has a fundamental military relevance as well, Patrick, which is one of the things that really stood out for us. It's relatively recent doctrine, but recognizing the convergence of what historically was treated as cyber operations as a kind of discrete area of practice and information operations. And American doctrine in particular has recognized how the separation between these is increasingly artificial and redundant because of the relationship between them. And even in fact, if we go, you mentioned earlier about how we define cyberspace, for example. I mean, cyberspace, it's already there. I mean, cyberspace is the internet, computer networks, and telecommunication networks. But many people, even at the policy level, even those that are designing frameworks and are responsible for cybersecurity, tend to focus overly much on internet-related threats, IT network security issues. Now, there's of course the very natural reason for that is how profound those threats can be on their own, and the difficulty in resourcing simply keeping pace with their evolution. So, of course, that's one aspect. Another aspect is that security incidents tends to be very narrowly defined in many countries today, and part of that, of course, is it can be there's a need for policy action to be able to measure damage. So, and if we note that cyber warfare is also understood to involve the attacks associated with espionage, being able to infiltrate network systems, exfiltrate data from them for intelligence purposes, to enable and further the military objectives. We also see that going on. That's actually what Ukraine is also defending against in denying Russian connectivity.
And what about the use of SIM boxes by Russian forces on the ground, both to get around the blocking of incoming Russian registered SIMs, but then also once there to also engage in psychological warfare against the local Ukrainian population? What are you made of all that?
I think that goes to the heart of the cyber war in Ukraine, Patrick, and it also illustrates the relevance of mobile network infrastructure to it. Because that appears to be a response to, as you pointed out, the denial of access and by Ukraine to the mobile network environment, the denial of mobile connectivity, and the contest for connectivity is how we fundamentally observe the broader cyber war to be unfolding, and that's consistent with one of the criticisms that has been levied at cyber war, just as a concept and just even as a useful way, or even as something that reflects, let's say, the warfighting utility of cyber tools, which is that to date, and this was a relatively recent study by two called Kostyuk and Zhukov, and they said that there had been no discernible impact on the behavior of those on the actual battlefield, of the forces actually at war, by cyber actions. And they said that, so that was the measure. Can you see a cyber attack or cyber enabled action that affects the behavior of the other side? And I think this is a very strong indicator of that, because it's a way around, it's a way to obviate the need to be able to register your Russian SIM to the network, and clearly to sustain command and control. At the same time, as you said, it also could fulfill that additional purpose of propagating psychological operations and messages at Ukrainian targets, soldiers and civilians alike. That's typically actually what those devices are used for, of course. As Cathal has pointed out, that is a very unreliable piece of equipment to be trying to build a military network on, or maintain military comms and run military operations on. And two, extremely, incredibly insecure. Also difficult to replicate at scale. So I think it's strongly suggestive that is a response by the invading force to this initial advantage in terms of the information environment, seized very, very quickly and decisively by Ukraine to deny Russia, to suppress their information environment. And just to conclude then on this point, that's where cyber war and military doctrine and mobile network infrastructure all intersects in one, in terms of the effects and the objectives on the defensive side, and of course recognizing the objectives of the attacker. It's Ukraine are able to suppress and deny and shape the information environment available to the invading force on the ground. Their ability to actually understand and interpret their environment. Broader than that as well, of course, it's part of an overall effort to deny Russia's ability to acquire targets in Ukraine using mobile network infrastructure. That's key. A really important example I want to give, one of the darkest ones, with remote targeting of weaponized infrastructure globally, the likes of the strike on the Yavoriv base on the 13th of March, that could potentially be enabled and supported by remote mobile network enabled targeting capabilities, where, for example, that the targets were acquired in the first place based on the identification and location in real time. That's one of the key elements and advantages for a state level threat actor, afforded by being able to weaponize their access to mobile networks, being able to identify targets in real time based on them being foreign SIMs in the country, a group of them together, being able to co-locate them with other infrastructure which you can identify again because of the ability to access the network and identify that location. So we're talking about the ability to acquire targets and the ability to time attacks and other strikes enabled and enhanced by weaponized mobile network access, both domestically from within a country. That's hence why the concern expressed by Natalia Tkachuk about captured equipment and infrastructure, and of course remotely as well. And of course, Ukraine is equally cited to both as an element of risk. And that's an added area. And that's part of why we talk about the need and what Ukraine demonstrates to deny that potential for weaponized connectivity and the incredible balance that they've been able to do with all of their measures in terms of security and resilience to maximize at the same time the availability of digital communication services to the Ukrainian people as well as to their own forces.
So let's sum up then. So let's suppose I'm the head of national cybersecurity for a given country, random country, Malaysia, Switzerland, Guatemala, whoever. What are the implications of what you've seen from Ukraine over the last couple of months? From what conclusions you've drawn? What would be your guidelines for national security folks in terms of the relevance integration of mobile networks as part of the national cybersecurity posture?
I think it starts with recognition that while it's legitimate to define, and to analyze even threats in different contexts and even in different domains, we talk about cyber threats and mobile network enabled threats. There has to be, though, an integrated approach at a higher level to the national defense of a country. For any country that's facing and recognizes either hybrid threats, I think there's little doubt now, there can be little doubt that we're in the era of hybrid warfare, or simply state-level cyber threats. Because the actors that prosecute those activities, as I stated earlier, they're not bound by any one protocol. There are multiple efforts, and I say actors, it's, let's say, the state entity that the behalf of which or directly by such activities are executed, which can involve multiple actors, state and non-state, prosecute their activities in cyberspace and around it at one and the same time, and within multiple domains within cyberspace. So the question to ask for those that are producing, say, national security, intelligence, advising governments, are mobile network related threats and enabled threats a part of that picture? And if they're not, it's not just that you're missing a different or separate area of threat, that can potentially undermine your ability to respond and your ability to plan, your ability to proactively defend against cyber threats as they're already captured in the defenses of the country. Because this overall multiplicity of vectors available to threat actors and their ability to exploit vulnerabilities in one impacts what they do in the other. It can embolden their overall aggression, and there's a knock-on impact. For example, the degree of even the identification of opportunities to attack a country's IT networks, those opportunities can be created and identified by exploiting mobile network vulnerabilities to identify the key targets, to track them in real time, to mount other operations, targeting operations against them and their associated networks. Remember that the ultimate objectives here is where they align. There's the initial intent capabilities of the actor, and then the outcome they desire. The different networks and interfaces that are used, it's almost they all actually, there are also many tools relevant at any particular time used by the actor. So it's important that, and you would probably say, Patrick, surely anyone would recognize the relevance of that statement. I think the question though is, are those defenses equally resourced as everything else is in the country that comes under the subject and banner of cybersecurity? Is it integrated into threat assessment at the strategic level? But so that's one aspect. But I think another major takeaway here is, and was clearly demonstrated by Ukraine, there's a massive opportunity here for operators to be key primary stakeholders in proactive cyber defense of a country by really leading that resilience. Because again, it's been highlighted that in terms of cyber defense generally, there's a tendency, because of the prevalence of 0 days and the speed and development of exploits, to kind of sit back and unfortunately wait for the next inevitable attack and respond, patch, wait and patch, or patch and wait, hope for the best. But there's recognized need to move to proactive defense. So for example, if you recognize that the unauthorized extraction by a state-level threat actor of an individual's IMSI, the electronic identifier for their device, recognizing that on its own can introduce a significant national security threat for a country, because it doesn't take place in isolation and it is not an isolated event. That is to enable further targeting, not only by further complex targeting executed over mobile network vectors, by other vectors, including other what are traditionally understood cyber vectors, and also attacks by human actors. So it's about understanding that by proactively having defenses that stop that from happening, fundamental network protections that come down to data protection. Actually, the fundamental principles then of information protection, such as confidentiality, integrity, and availability of communications, those then become an integral part and the foundation of your overall cybersecurity framework, and a fundamental part and a way to strengthen national security frameworks in defensive countries.
So in other words, there's mobile threat intelligence that currently doesn't feature in a lot of countries' national cybersecurity plans. They don't actually feature as incidents, but they really should.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and this is readily discoverable. If you look at the definition in the policy guidance documents and in many cybersecurity strategies and frameworks, legislative frameworks that are published, it's the definition of a security incident, as I spoke about earlier. Because of the comparative difficulty in quantifying the damage, that's what it comes down to. And it's fair. Policymakers and governments want to say we need what can we objectively base our decisions on and action on. So measure the damage. How do you measure the damage? The duration of the outage, the number of subscribers affected, the percentage of availability of communications in a particular area. But what about a single instance or repeated instances of location tracking of somebody of strategic importance to a country? That won't tick those established criteria that are generally the rule and are generally used as the mechanism, part of the initial response mechanism for a country to identify threats, which means that these potentially strategically important espionage-related threats, state-level threats, aren't reported. They tend not to make it into the discussions and the rooms where such threats are being discussed in every other context. So the threat actor maintains that advantage. They have all of these vectors they can move in and move between, move through at the same time. But those on the defensive side, lacking a way to surmount that with, as I said, proactive defense and an integrated view of cybersecurity as being more than just IT and even more than just cyberspace, is the only way to actually to get around that. But this is also an opportunity, and it's a way to recognize an opportunity to obviate that, I guess, historical difficulty and deficiency in prevailing cybersecurity frameworks.
Spectacular. Rowland, thanks ever so much for sharing all that.
Well, thank you it's been great to engage with you, Patrick. Thanks.
So finally, let's get to our last section, which is always one where we look at some significant news items in the world of mobile network security and take the thoughts and views and guidelines of adaptive mobile security around how to deal with that. And this first one we're going to look at is this recent FCC publication, where they've talked about sharing plans for requiring international carriers to support the STIR/SHAKEN standard, the one for blocking caller ID, spoofing, and illegitimate robocalls. Now, I guess, as is often the case with sort of regulated guidelines, one might have expected a decent amount of discussion and perhaps opposition by the international carriers themselves, because, as we know, STIR/SHAKEN is a fairly controversial standard. But what's been surprising about this one, I think, Simeon, is actually a lot of the objections, and really quite striking ones, have actually come from the big US carriers themselves. What do you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I mean, the first thing is we've now got about 9 months worth of data available for the US on how STIR/SHAKEN has really affected the ecosystem, after near $500 million of spending on it. And, there's been some great analysis of that data. The headline is, good news, been a 12% reduction in robocalls. Bad news, unfortunately, is that spammers have adopted authentication. These controls really have ended up having a fairly limited benefit. Diving a little bit more into the statistics, 4% of unauthenticated calls are robocalls, but 4% of authenticated calls are robocalls. So, bad actors really don't stop their behavior due to simple checks. What they do, and we see this time and time again, in every type of security, is bad actors incorporate the pretense of being authentic into their scams. Right. In fact, when we actually look, with STIR/SHAKEN, there's 3 different grades of attestation. B and C grade attestation calls are actually 3 times more likely to be robocalls as unauthenticated. So that really is explaining why there's been a rollback in statements that, STIR/SHAKEN isn't a silver bullet solution. even within just the US ecosystem. And so, it shouldn't be treated as such for, a broader, more complex international traffic landscape. I mean, really, to summarize, the continuing security mantra that, technology and process alone don't turn a corrupt situation into a good situation, Patrick.
Yeah. Absolutely. What about our old friend Pegasus that's been making headlines here in the UK, no less? We've got a bunch of human rights activists in the UK launching a lawsuit against NSA. There's even been reports, including in the New Yorker, of a Pegasus-infected device having found to be connected to the network of number 10 Downing Street, no less. I mean, I guess ultimately, from an adaptive mobile perspective, what can you guys actually do in terms of protecting against illegal use or unauthorized use of Pegasus?
Well, I mean, first off, I think let's actually look at the environment that Pegasus is targeting. I mean, we're first off considering, the ecosystem out there. We've got over 6 billion phones in our pockets, embedded into so much of our daily lives. The complexity of the network technology, the multiple vendors and protocols, the varying maturity of standards. Compound that with handset and device side complexity, the continuing push for updating handset operating systems, and couple that with the huge array of apps running on that, all of those things create an attack surface. So, and that's actually not even mentioning the embedded IoT market as well, where we're getting more and more devices connected where, they've had no previous need for network security hardening. So really, the technology and the tools exist for surveillance companies and state threat level actors and organized crime groups to spy. So, there's a broad surface there to protect. I mean, particularly we have detected a number of messages containing Pegasus links in customer deployment. So, there's absolutely the potential there for operators to do more. And, this can be helped by more cooperation and intelligence investment in security.
Right. I think, we're talking about Pegasus here, and in his previous remarks, Rowland was talking about the importance of, advanced threats, in some cases, because they only target one or two individuals in some cases, not meeting the kind of standard of an incident in some national security circles. And we're talking about Pegasus, isn't it? It's incredibly important. We have to protect against it. But by the same token, I'm also stuck by, when you're able to send, tens, hundreds of millions of spam messages as a hostile actor, for example, in the context of Ukraine, where you're able to use spam messages for psychological warfare against the local population, mislead them about things that are going on, which can have a material effect on things. I guess we should also be wary, when the Guardian is producing, 20 pages at a time talking about Pegasus, all incredibly important, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, there is as much, if not more, damage that can be done by these very advanced threats like Pegasus as can be done just by plain old text messaging and, the spamming of those text messages, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's really critical is that there are a range of attack options available to bad actors. Yeah, if they want to target a lot of people with a very broad message, they can do that. If they want to spear an individual attack against a very small number of users, they can do that. But also they can share weaknesses in systems across those. So, really sort of looking at these attack types, both are inseparable, but also both are complementary. We know that attackers are seeking access to SS7 networks. They're using networks for broad spread intelligence as well as obtaining intelligence on the individual. So, absolutely, Patrick. It's a case of some attacks can be very specific, very detailed. Some can be very broad. Everything needs to really be defended against.
Yeah, and I think maybe worth reflecting as well. Always, I think that NSO is, a leading actor, arguably the leading actor in this space. It gets a tremendous amount of attention, but always worth recalling that they're not the only folks in this space, right?
Oh, most definitely not. Yeah, there are many different groups, many different threat groups with actually, again, a broad range of objectives of what they're trying to do. As you mentioned, Patrick, these can be sometimes just as simple as demotivating communication or designed for broad spectrum, wide audience attacks. I mean, and not just in particular environments. I mean, really, frankly, who now has never received something damaging and harmful, whether it be on the mobile network or any other form of messaging? It's just something widespread that we have in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thanks very much indeed, Simeon, and indeed to Rowland. One very last item that I'm more than delighted to share with you, as should be viewable on your screen either now or just coming up, is that on June 22nd and 23rd, AdaptiveMobile Security will be the diamond sponsor for the second year running of the HardenStance Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit. Cathal McDade, AdaptiveMobile CTO, will be one of the key speakers, along with operator speakers from KPN, TELUS, Deutsche Telekom, Orange, and a number of other key vendor and third-party consultant and industry association speakers. It is on June 22nd and 23rd, the afternoons thereof. It's a live event. Anybody can register live with a bona fide email address of some kind. Hope very much you'll join us for that. And in the meantime, that concludes yet another Trust Talks. Thank you very much indeed for participating. Hope to see you at the next one. Thanks very much.